All right, without further ado, I want to introduce Jessica, and let's get started in this important conversation. I know you guys have been looking forward to it, and so have I. So will you guys help me welcome Jessica?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. We're Union Station's partner in the exhibition, and we've been providing all of the wraparound educational support for folks visiting the exhibit. So I'm so excited to be here. I understand that you have not only been to the exhibit, but that you had the experience of having Michael come and visit with your pastor. So that's a really remarkable opportunity. And you've had a great deal of information shared with you already. So what I'm hoping is that tonight we can be a little bit interactive, we can have some discussion, because one of the things that we're very interested in Holocaust education is moving from that acquisition of knowledge to really assimilating it and finding a way to make it personal and have an impact in our lives and in our world. So that's part of what my hope is for tonight, is that we can have that kind of a discussion. So when I was thinking about how to put this together and what themes we could draw out, I immediately went to the thought of what we call the muddled middle in Holocaust studies. So we understand the victim experience, and we understand who the perpetrators are. But the truth is that the vast majority of the people who were involved in the Holocaust were neither of those two groups. By far, they existed somewhere in the middle. And so I'm curious, just shout it out. If you think about somebody who was not a victim or who was not a perpetrator, who do you think of when you think of the Holocaust? Okay, so I would put the Jews in the victim category, though. Okay, so it's just general civilians. Okay, witnesses. Military. You did not go where I thought you were going to go. Most people jump to Schindler. For most people that are adults in America today, there is kind of this immediate jump to Schindler, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One, it was a popular movie. But two, it has to do with Americans' real desire for there to find a happy ending in this, to find something good in this. And so a lot of times we jump to rescuers. So I want to talk about Schindler for a minute because I think he sets up what I want us to talk about tonight. So first of all, Schindler is no Liam Neeson, right? Here's the real Schindler. And he is a very ordinary man with ordinary faults. And over the 12 years of the Holocaust, he does what most people do, in that he changes position, and his interaction with this event that's happening in his world is moving and shifting. So he is kind of initially a fairly neutral party, and in Holocaust language that has often been called a bystander. So he's somebody that seemingly has a very distant or no connection to the event. Then we see that he becomes a member of the Nazi Party. He becomes a war profiteer, meaning that he takes over a business that has been Aryanized. It has been taken away from Jewish ownership and has been put in his power. And then he utilizes forced labor from the concentration camp system, largely Jewish slave labor. So he's a war profiteer. But somewhere in the midst of that, he again shifts. So he's moved from the middle toward perpetration, and then he's going to come back all the way to the Schindler that we have learned about in that movie, to becoming a rescuer. And what I think is valuable about the Schindler example is that all of the muddled middle did this, okay? There are absolutely people on the far ends of this spectrum of responsibility. There are people who were truly altruistic and put themselves in danger and were self-sacrificing in a way to protect someone. And then there were people who were ideological killers. Everybody else exists in this middle. Those people had to do what I would argue we all have to do in our world today. They had to move from a place where they gathered information and they took in facts, and then they had to go through these steps of processing it to make it to the point of action. Okay, so just as people had decisions to make in the Holocaust, I would argue that one of the lessons is that we have to make those decisions in our world today. When we are confronted with something, we have to make an ethical decision about how we're going to interact with that history that's happening around us. So just very, very briefly, I want to give a little bit of the language that I'd like us to be thinking about tonight. And then we're going to look at a Holocaust example, and then we're going to look at some examples from our world. And I want to give you all an opportunity to really dig into this and have a discussion. So what kind of responses did we see in the Holocaust? Closest to the perpetrators are the collaborators. And they exist in every country that the Germans put jackboots in. Every place that they invade, they find people who are sympathetic to their cause. Whether that is their war aims, their economic aims, or their policies against the Jewish community or the Roma community or the homosexual community, whichever community it is that is being persecuted in that moment and that space. And we see collaboration happen on a variety of scales. It can be everything from simply informing on a neighbor, saying there is a Jewish family living or hiding here, you can come and take them, to actually moving towards perpetration themselves. So maybe they didn't pull the trigger, but they may have conducted the roundup. So we have all sorts of instances of local complicity, law enforcement, and neighbors turning on each other and bringing those Jewish people to the Germans. The far end of that spectrum are these rescuers. And rescuers exist on a spectrum even within themselves. Here I have focused on what we call the righteous among the nations. These are people that rescued or attempted to rescue at least one Jewish person, but did so without reward. So there are plenty of examples of people who were paid or in some other way gained benefit from having providing a hiding place or some sort of support for a Jewish person. But these examples, and I'm going to draw your attention in particular, next to the color photograph, there's the staggered double photograph. That is a couple who saved one of our local survivors. They hid her and her family in a root cellar under their barn for 27 months in Poland. And then we get back to this concept of a bystander. And I want to set a couple of tones for how we're going to talk about this. First of all, I want to establish the fact that inaction is a choice, okay? There is a tradition, and I hope that many of you had the opportunity to read that Victoria Barnett article where she talks about the shift that we've had in our thinking about bystanders in the Holocaust. But essentially, we've moved away from the concept that these are just neutral observers, because even an attempt to maintain that neutrality is a choice. So if you look at this photograph, I'm interested what strikes you about it. The teacups on the windowsill. It's a real perspective, right? This person has been doing some very ordinary thing in their life, and they look out their window, and there is the Jewish community being pulled out of their homes. And what you don't know, but we know historically, and what this person would have had some inkling of, is that these are Jewish people, and they are being sent to Westerbork, which is a transit camp in the Netherlands, which feeds directly to Auschwitz. Now, the lady with the teacups probably doesn't know that they're going to Westerbork or Auschwitz. But what might she know? It's not good to be taken out of your home, right? This is an action that is causing duress to that community. So she certainly knows that something's not right. What about the perspective that it's pulled back and you can see the teacups? What does that tell you? okay. I don't know if everybody could hear, he said that she's comfortable, that it's not happening to her. Not the first time, possibly. My read on this is a little different, and we're never going to know which of us is right. But my read on this is that she is not getting up close to take that photograph where somebody can see her, right? That she's pulled back. But she understood that it was something worth documenting. It's a big enough issue that she wanted to take this photograph. So inaction is a choice. And silence is a choice. And I want to share with you this video from a man named Kurt Messerschmidt. He is a survivor of German origin, and he's going to, about 2 minutes here, talk to you about his experiences on Kristallnacht.
1938. That's one of those dates which I can never forget, and we all don't forget it. When November 10th every year comes around, I'm the one who remembers this day vividly, while even my non-American friends, American Jewish friends, don't remember it unless they read finally about it. This was the so-called Crystal Night. That night, I listened to the radio, forbidden, BBC, the night before, and read all about what had happened in Paris, and that measurements would be taken to avenge the death of this Herrn vom Rath, killed by a Jewish boy. I listened to the radio in a friend's house, and I rushed home, woke up the next morning. My transportation to school was about 7 miles, was by bicycle. I was fortunate at that point. I still was allowed to have a bicycle. All these things were taken away later. I went through all these things, we lost everything. But on bicycle, I went through 7 miles of glass splinters. It's amazing that the bicycle lasted. And my dear colleague, Uri Sonnenfeld, who was the main sports coach, was still there, and we sat there for a moment, deciding what to do. But there was no question. We took our bicycles and made a tour of the whole city of Berlin. We came to Friedrichstraße. It's a well-known term now. There was a little, very tiny cigar shop. The owner was a very, very old man, tiny old gentleman. But there were people standing around, 40, 50 people, and 2 of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, not SS. SS are the one in the black uniforms, and and these are the brown shirts. Of course, with all their equipment, and they forced this very old gentleman to pick up the tiny glass splitters one by one. And they forced this man to do this. And they all were standing there and watching. We didn't know what to think, but the only thing we could think of was help. So we put our bicycles down. Rudy and I, we went in front of that group that was surrounding this old gentleman, went down on our knees, and started picking up glass splitters one by one to help this man. Briefly, I looked at the 2 guys. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Why did they not move? I asked myself. Are they afraid that the people might agree with us or not? I've never figured out what it was. But I'm sure in this particular situation that some of the people standing there disapproved of what the Nazis did. But their disapproval was only silence. And silence is what did the harm. In 1938,
So I just want to let that sit for a minute because I think it's profound. Another issue that we always have to consider, whether we're dealing with bystanders, perpetrators, collaborators, is self-interest. There is often a belief that people were acting more out of self-preservation, that they were themselves under some level of duress, and that is certainly more true in the occupied space of Europe than maybe in 1930s Germany, as Kurt just alluded to. There were no repercussions for the fact that they got on their knees and helped him. Other people could have done that. And so I'd like to take just a minute here to speak to this point of self-interest. And it's such a human thing to do, right? To consider your own needs and your own wants. So I'd like to walk through these two pictures with you. What do you see in this photograph? Okay, so you think they're disembarking from something, okay? Right, it's a very solemn mood. Yes, there are people up in that window. And there's quite a large crowd behind them as well, right? Aside from the people who are uniformed, can you get any read on who these people are? Yeah, there are absolutely children here. If you're looking kind of behind the lady with the roll under her arm, that is a child for sure. There are also children on the balcony. Given the context that we all know that we're here because you've been to an Auchwitz exhibit and this is a Holocaust presentation, let's layer a little bit of that on. Who do you think you're looking at? Okay, which people are the Jews? Okay, the most solemn, correct? The people that are being moved somewhere. You are correct. Okay, so this is in the town of Lörrach, Germany, in October of 1940. These are Jewish people being removed from their homes and sent to destinations unknown, except potentially to the men in uniform. This is from the local newspaper announcing an auction that is going to happen on November 23rd, 1940. It is a typical auction announcement. It lists some of the items that would be available there, the time that they should arrive, the company that's conducting the auction. This is the next photograph that we have from this town. What can you tell me about this photograph? Okay, it's crowded. I think I heard the word sale. This is the auction. These are the same townspeople that watched their neighbors being forcibly removed from their homes that are now attending the auction of the items from their homes. Okay. In some ways, these are bystanders. These are neither perpetrators nor collaborators nor rescuers. They don't fit another category. But are they neutral? So that's the issue that we really want to deal with today. I'm going to give you one final example, and that is from an occupied country. Okay, so it's a slightly different issue to talk about these muddled middles that are in Germany in the 1930s and then living under occupation, say in Poland or Hungary or France. Okay? However, there are a great many of those people in those countries, and here you see an example of them being witness to direct murder. And the question becomes, what were they doing there? If you stopped in the section in the exhibition about the Einsatzgruppen, you heard Dr. David Marwell speak about an execution just like this, where he points out the bystanders who have come as though this is like a picnic opportunity, right? They've come out to witness this execution, and he makes a remark, why is the dog there? Who brought the dog? That might trigger your memory on this video. But that is this scenario. Those people in the red circle don't have to be there, yet they are there witnessing this. And it brings up the fact, whether it's the Holocaust or a genocide that's happening today, this is always happening in front of witnesses. These things are never truly secretive or truly behind a closed door. Final example, and then I promise we're going to visit. Sometimes whole nations don't fit into a category, okay? So when we talk, for instance, about the American response to the Holocaust, there's all sorts of debate and discussion about what could America have done, what should America have done. It's a difficult thing to discuss, but I want to give you this example to just kind of ponder. Following Kristallnacht, so the event that Kurt Messerschmidt just explained, this is a public opinion poll taken in November 1938 of American adults. And the question is, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazis' treatment of the Jews? And it's an overwhelming statement that we disapprove of anti-Jewish actions in Germany. The follow-up question is, should we let them into our country? And the answer is a resounding no. So faced with an obvious civil rights abuse, an obvious humanitarian crisis, there was an acknowledgement that that was happening, but an immediate response that it was not our problem. So these are the things that I want us to ponder tonight. What is our responsibility as people who understand the Holocaust and who have good knowledge of events in our world, right? So I'd like to start with a Holocaust example and give you an opportunity to discuss that, and then move to something that's a little more current. So I hope that you all received the reading that was sent out. It's a report from a low-level German officer who was accompanying a deportation transport from Dusseldorf to Riga in 1941, if I remember correctly. 1941, December 1941. So I want to give you guys, let's say, we'll see how much discussion is happening, and you might want to combine tables if you're alone. But I'd like to give you somewhere between 7 to 10 minutes. And what I'd really like for you to do is discuss that reading and anything else that we've presented tonight, but come back with an idea in your head or a list written down. Who are the people or the groups, whether they are expressly in Saul Leader's report or they're just implied? Who was there? Who had a connection to this event? Now that we're thinking about bystanders, who are the bystanders to this event of this single deportation to Riga? So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Shelley Klein, who's our historian and our director of education, and we're going to facilitate a discussion.
If you're sitting and there's only one or two people at your table, I want to encourage you to stand up and join a table so you can have great discussion during this time. Thanks, guys.
When my soul is overcome and my voice is all but gone, the saints of earth and heaven raise a song for me, my heart rejoices. sweet, sweet melody, and it's all I ever need. It's calling out my name. Lead me on. I'm in sweet, sweet company, and it's all I ever need. It takes me by the hand and leads me on. There's power in your melody and lives within me. I'm singing on. There's power in your melody and lifts my wings and carries me on. There's a sweet, sweet melody. It's all I'll ever need. It's calling out my name. Lead me on. I'm in sweet, sweet company. It's all I'll ever need. It takes me by the hand, leads me on. There's power in your melody that lives within me. I'm singing on. There's power in your melody. It lifts my wings and carries me on.
I always hate to break up what seems to be a good discussion, but I think that Melanie and Shelley are going to kind of come around, and I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about what you're discussing at your table, whether it's the people the people in the groups, or if you got off on Kurt Messerschmitt or something from the exhibit. Does anybody want to share? Oh, I'm having a real problem with my clicker.
He walks with me. Oh, how he loves me. Leads me on those running waters.
Ordinary people, yes. Okay, so yeah, but do you have an example, like a specific example, like one group that stood out to you? Okay, do you have an example? Okay, so okay, local police. The cleaning lady, that's a weird one, right? So when we talk about the train stations, I think we're talking about what both of you have been saying. One would be the people running the station, so the conductors and the ticket takers and the people even cleaning the grounds at these train stations. But then there's also just the people getting on other trains, not deportation trains, just maybe one going to Berlin or something, right? So normal travelers who would have encountered this deportation.
Jessica, we have some online. I'm going to let Katie share those.
Okay, so Robin says the people at the sale. And we have from Lynn, the folks in the house next door who returned the woman.
Okay, so this is a different example than the photograph set, but the same would be true for their local neighbors, right? So when we think about the woman who escaped and ended up being caught by the cleaning lady, or the man who was hit by the bus driver, right? The streetcar. There are houses, there are buildings around that. So the same phenomenon that we saw in that photograph would be happening there. Just tell me and I'll say it.
The National Socialism in Germany, the Nazi, they had a very thick network of many people considering that they were doing a very good and excellent work for their countries. So there was a propaganda where they said, you know, the Jews are not good and we need just to, Jews, Roma, Polish, and the Russians, and many, there was the militias over there. You have the police and many other groups that were very, very, they were with the Nazi, and that's what we have. There was some kind of collective madness. We saw that for many, many years, in many centuries, during beginning between the 1932 until 1945, people, and at the end, you know, in the concentration camps, many soldiers and officers, they used to have their family there. They used to go to work from 9 or from 8 to 12 and from 2 to 7. And they thought they were doing a great job for their country, for the moral, in order to have a great people. And they were convinced every day doing that. And they used to go back home and they have their children. They have all the people there, the family. And they were really surprised when, at the end of the war, they considered them as war criminals. They said, we didn't do anything bad.
So let me kind of recap for those who maybe couldn't hear or are online. The issue this gentleman raised is that among the perpetrators, there's a real ideological belief in the fact that they are doing something good for their country. There are perpetrators who fit that category, absolutely. There are other perpetrators who land more in the middle. So there are perpetrators who we have excellent evidence are acting out of self-interest. They may go to the front and start shooting Jewish people, Jewish civilians, because they want a raise and they want a promotion. And wartime service and frontline service is the way to accomplish that. So you bring up an excellent point about perpetration, but even perpetration exists on this continuum, and people can shift and move. And so Saul Leader is one of these men who seems to be pretty ideologically driven, right? If you read his testimony, he's saying things about how they should be improving this process, both for the guards' experience, but also to be more effective against the Jewish community. So thank you for bringing up the...
All the soldiers, German soldiers, used to say, God mit uns, which means God is with us. We cannot be wrong. We are not wrong because God is with us. When you say that, and after that they remind them that all the Jews, the people killed Jesus, etc., etc. And you need to read Mein Kampf by Hitler.
I have read Mein Kampf. It's not a good book.
Okay, but you know what? For Hitler, Jesus was a person who used to whip in the temple the merchants.
So, yes, this is just not where we're going with this conversation. I really appreciate your point, but I would like us to come back to this idea of the middle, because there's a point in Holocaust education where, yes, we can identify people who were categorically wrong and they did evil things. But there's not a whole lot we can learn from that, because it's really easy to distance ourselves from that and say, I'm not evil. But I'm not very different than most of the people in these scenarios. And that's what I'm hoping to draw out of this conversation is how can we find that humanity in this experience and learn from it. So I'd like to just give you a sense. This is a list that Shelley and I have put together of people that you could have identified out of this document that in one way or another came into contact with this transport. A single transport of 1,007 Jews from Dusseldorf to Riga. Is there anything on here that surprises you or that you didn't think of yourselves? Okay. Does anybody remember him speaking about the Red Cross? They interacted with this transport in support of the guards. So then we're put in the uncomfortable position of needing to consider how responsible are each of these groups or each of these people? And what's the difference between having some degree of responsibility and then guilt? Right? Guilt implies potentially maybe something legal or something prosecutable. So I think those words mean something different here. And I'm not going to be able to give you a large amount of time for this, but I'd love to give you another 5 minutes to consider these 3 questions about this group of people. And then you can bring into this discussion at your table, if you'd like, these more ideological perpetrators that this gentleman has brought up. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about these questions. everybody. Okay. I hope what has just happened at your table is that you've discovered that these are hard questions to come to consensus on. That there are some individuals that are very easy to say, that is a guilty person. They are very responsible. But that then it gets real gray, and we're looking at levels of responsibility, and at what level do we reach guilt? Okay? So it's not that there are definitive answers to this, but what I wanted to draw out of this Holocaust example is that there are always more people touching this event than are immediately recognized, right? It's not just the people immediately and directly responsible or the people that are immediately experiencing the event. It's the entire atmosphere around them and the people in that atmosphere. Please do.
We also think in terms of time. So some of these people have prolonged opportunity to make choices. Some of them are involved for a long time. Saul leader, he's writing reports. Some people, like the cleaning woman, she has an instant, she makes a decision, she turns in that Jewish woman. So not only are we talking about a different variety of people, we also have to think in terms of these, sometimes it comes down to just a moment. And that adds up to quite a lot when we're talking about this entire experience. And I think, when we move into the, talking in terms of modern period, we have to think too, what are the moments in our own life, right? So I think time is important because that also adds to what level of responsibility there is, right? So just another thing to complicate it.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. So what I really wanted to move us to was thinking about today. As people who have cared enough to go to this exhibition, who have cared to come tonight to learn more, I assume that means that you are people that care about what the lessons of this event are in your lives and how you implement something from this knowledge into your world. And so I want to think about that today. I'm going to give you just a couple, 3 examples maybe, and then give you an opportunity to discuss. So one thing that we can think about is, for instance, that 1938 American opinion poll. There's a refugee crisis in Germany and Austria, and the opinion is that we do not let those people immigrate to the United States. What we know is that in our world, there are refugee crises and there are immigration issues today. So these are examples from our own border. The top photograph is on the Mexican border. The second photograph is from, within a couple of weeks, and it's on the Polish-Belarusian border. So these are very current issues in our own world that we as a global community need to grapple with. This is a July 2021, so very, very current, State Department report outlining 6 instances of current genocide and/or human rights atrocities happening in our world. And it lists the 6 locations where those are currently occurring. This is obviously an evolving list, but this is invoking the word genocide. This is in no way neutral. This is in no way subjective. They are saying that genocide is being perpetrated in these 6 locations. It can be these big international events, or it can be something at home. It can be American race issues and how our communities are interacting with each other and the dialogues that we're having. It can be the current very disturbing trend that we're seeing in people invoking the Holocaust to discuss vaccines and masks. Okay? The issue is, when you see something, what is your obligation to interact with that event or the people in that event? So what I'd like to do is give you an opportunity to really think that through with the people that you're sitting with. So, again, we're trying to move from knowledge to understanding to action. How are we trying to do that? And one of the things I'd like you to consider is what elevates an event happening anywhere, in town or across the world? What brings it to the level where you feel personally responsible, personally committed to taking an action? That's going to be a unique answer for every person in this room, but it's something that I think is worth discussing. And so I'd like to give you, let's say, about 7 to 8 minutes to start to have this discussion. I would love to hear where some of your conversations have gone, what issues you discussed, or if you personally arrived at any answers. Is anybody willing to share? I can't really see, so I'm not sure if anybody is offering. This is where it gets hard, right? When it stops being history and it starts being you in the present. What issues did you discuss? I'm not actually expecting that, I hope that in 5 minutes you didn't arrive at grand answers, but what did you discuss?
We discussed, you can hear me. We discussed like our responsibilities today and where we might have been back then, and thought that maybe we were letting ourselves off too easily today, and probably back then too, that we weren't as morally pure, and I don't mean that racially, I mean that we weren't as Jesus following as we should have been.
Okay, so a deep look at your own ethics, yes. Or lack thereof. And the truth is that everybody operates every day with their ethics, but sometimes we put a pin in it, if you will, right? There's a moment that it's like, oh, there's a reason I'm going to sidestep this or that. And as Shelley mentioned, that can cumulatively become very important in someone else's life.
Very briefly, when you have the moment to do something. So this example, some of the Holocaust examples we were talking about, the system was already off into genocide. By the time it gets to genocide, your options are somewhat limited and the stakes are very high, especially if you're in an occupied territory or in proximity, right? But when some of these examples, we're talking about when we have an opportunity to do something before it's too late, before the stakes get too high for everyone. And I think that's a good moment to reflect on. You know, all of us are on a position of some privilege right now because we're sitting here in a fantastic facility listening and discussing these important ideas. It's a real privilege to be able to do that. How can we use our positions of privilege effectively in these small moments before they get so big that they're well outside of our controls as individuals?
To bring that back to the Holocaust, I can tell you we're often asked, you know, why didn't the US do this, that, or the other thing? Would this have made a difference? And our answer is always that by the time Auschwitz is Auschwitz, it's too late, right? Those people were caught in a system and a machine that really, at that point, winning the war was what was going to save them. And the moment to act was in the 30s, right?
I have a question. So why did some of these bystanders, I can do it without it. Why did some of these bystanders not act? Why did they wait until it was too late?
I think that each person would give you a different answer. I think that's part of the very difficult thing that we're discussing, and something that came out in the Barnett article, if you've had a chance to read it, that essentially we're looking at a collective crime, but it's made up of all these individual actions, right? And so everybody had their own motive, whether it was self-preservation, self-interest, disinterest. It's just a variety.
Fear?
Absolutely.
Why would the cleaning
and
lady turn the
especially in
person
an
in?
occupied country. Now, I will say that one thing we cannot do is let people off the hook and say that that was always the case. So even men who were shooting in the Einsatzgruppen had the opportunity to remove themselves from that service. And what the studies have shown is that for the most part they didn't, because of peer pressure. That they would not have been executed, they would not have been punished. They may have been sent to the front, but that's now a self-interest decision, right? Were you coming to get the microphone?
Let me give you a quick example of when bystanders in early Nazi Germany were effective in a good way. So soon after, Hitler comes to, Nazis come to power, Hitler is in power January 1933. In April, there's a boycott, a state-organized boycott against Jewish German businesses. So the point is to separate out so that there's this big show, don't buy from the Jews anymore, they're not really German. This boycott is supposed to last a couple weeks, and it lasts basically a weekend. Because people weren't on board yet. They were inconvenienced, they didn't like it, and they took that, so the positive bystander feedback was they didn't like it. So then the government goes back, ramps up some propaganda, they understand that the German population isn't quite ready for this move. But what's interesting is if you think about that reaction, those people who just kept going to those stores, even though there was a sign up that said, don't buy here, walked past the guards that said, trying to keep them out, because they simply wanted to keep going about their regular lives. So it's those small actions, and those are the moments where we think, when you see something like, as small as ignoring a boycott, that's where you can affect some positive change. So it's an early example, and it's exactly as Jessica said. They're nothing genocidal yet, right? It's these public demonstrations about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and what impact we can have in our choices.
Before we move towards closing, does anybody else want to offer a thought or share something that you...
In terms of the pre-genocidal, I think that those of us who grew up in the South can relate to a lot of the fear, the peer pressure, self-interest, if you will, of not acting, and wish we had to have acted. But while, it was really bad, it didn't rise to the level of the Holocaust, but certainly it was a difficult situation, and people, many of us, became bystanders in that situation. And so I guess the lesson for today is to try to figure out the next best thing. And if there becomes a situation like that again, will we act? And we have a lot of polarization in this country right now, so I don't know that we can just sit back and say it will never happen.
Thank you. I think there was somebody up here too.
I was just going to add to the question about, why wouldn't people respond? Why wouldn't they take responsibility? And for me, I think it's really the fear factor. Now, I know that in these occupied countries where the Jews were being collected and they were being relocated first to Jewish ghettos, and then from the Jewish ghettos they were relocated to the camps. And I lived in Poland for several years. The Polish people felt like they couldn't do anything because if they were caught harboring a Jewish person, it was death. It was death to them and death to their family. So the stakes were very, very high for a lot of these bystanders, if you will, that were watching this. And it was, frankly, fear.
So we're talking about levels now, right? So an occupation like existed in Poland, you could end up in a camp yourself, right, for harboring Jews. The flip side is bystander also applies to the person who turned in his neighbor for a pound of sugar, right? So there are degrees. And the occupation does matter, because in the Netherlands, where Anne Frank and her family are being hidden, her rescuers are sent to concentration camps but live, and only 2 of the 4 are sent to the concentration camp and kept in livable conditions. So the occupation does matter. There's no question about that. But then there are still, even within this term bystander, it's such a difficult term. It doesn't work because it covers too much. And so there's an issue of not rescuing, which is what you're talking about, because that could put you in fear of your life. But then there's, turning away the woman who just wanted a piece of bread when she went by too, which would not have cost you your life. So it's shades of gray. Anybody else? So I want to leave you with these two quotes. One is from a scholar of the Holocaust named Yehuda Bauer. And his statement is that there is literally nothing worse you can be than a bystander. The other quote is from a man named Gerald Kaplan, who is an authority on the Rwandan genocide. And his stance is that we can't expect that from people. It's too much. It's two sides of the coin. And what I hope we have done tonight with this discussion is made this something that you will think about and grapple with. Because for Holocaust education to have meaning in our world, we've got to take those lessons and move them into the present. So I invite you just to think about these two concepts of being a bystander and to think about what that means in your life. It has really been Shelley and I's pleasure to be with you tonight. I hope this has been a meaningful conclusion to your 3-week exploration of this. So thank you to Church of the Resurrection, to Melanie for inviting us. I'm going to turn back over to Melanie.
You guys give her a big round of applause. I don't know about you, but I found that very enriching, especially after spending those hours walking through the exhibit. And as I was telling Jessica and Shelley, a few years ago, my husband and I were in Germany, and we had the opportunity to visit Dachau concentration camp, and just the lessons learned there. And I will say it's an experience that sits heavy on us. It should sit heavy on us. But I hope that tonight's conversation starts prompting us to think about where are the places in our current world where it's early on in these discussions, it's early on in these crises where we can take action before it becomes too big of a deal for us to gather. So I encourage you, as you leave tonight, as Jessica's encouraged us, to sit with some of these thoughts and to think through, in this particular place, as followers of Christ, what would Jesus ask us to do in these situations? Where are the places where God is asking us to, nudging us to speak up, to take action, to do something to be different? I think you're going to hear in the next couple months different places where Resurrection is going to be partnering with some of our local ministries who work with some of our refugees that will be coming to the Kansas City area. There's going to be opportunities for you to serve, for you to get to jump in and to be a part of that. And so I hope you'll be keep your ears open for those. We're really excited about that. But I encourage you not to let tonight be the end of this conversation. This is, to me, again, while it's week 3, this is a jumping off point. So continue to have these conversations with your friends, with your loved ones. Continue to stay up to date on what things are happening in our world. And continue to be open to what the Holy Spirit is leading you to do, whether that's to speak up or to act out. And so I know I'm going to be thinking about those things over the next couple weeks and months, and so I hope you guys will be too. So again, just the beginning of our conversations. Will you give me one more round of applause for Shelley and Jessica just coming out tonight and leading us through that? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this in prayer, and then we'll be here, so don't feel like you have to run out. If you're still interested in having more conversation, please stay and visit. If you've got questions, we'll be here for a little bit too. And then lastly, I'll just remind you again that one of the things we are doing for Christmas is open table dinners. So if you're interested in hosting those, some of you have heard of those before, that we call those dinners for 8 sometimes. At Resurrection, we don't like fast, hard rules, so we call it 8-ish. So that's why we've got open tables. So if you'd be interested in hosting one of those, come talk with me. I'd love to get you all started and set up with that. Great opportunity. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for the opportunity to have discussion about what we're learning. God, I pray that you would move us beyond learning history into moving into action in our world. God, all of us probably can think of a time where we wish we had spoken up, where we wish we had taken action. God, would you use this experience to encourage us to the next time we're in that place, to use our voice, to use our actions, God, to make a difference in somebody else's life. God, rather that be the person in line in front of us or someone in our world. We invite you to speak through us, God. We pray that we would be present and hear your voice the next time that arises. God, may we learn from these stories, this heaviness that sits with us, God. May we live with that right now, God. Will we lean into that, and may we hear your voice speak to us as we wrestle with those things. We pray you would be with each person as we go through the rest of our week. We're excited for that. God, all these things we give to you, knowing that you're big enough to take care of them. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks, you guys, and thanks for everyone who joined us online tonight.